attacker to bypass UEFI Secure Boot permissions. Additionally, I'm also going to present to you some bypasses that allow an attacker to bypass Intel architecture permissions to execute rootkits, bypassing protections that would also be operating in system management mode otherwise. So, getting started into the water here. Generally speaking, it's advantageous for an attacker to try and get their rootkits to execute earlier than later in the boot process. This is simply just a general guideline because code that executes earlier in the boot process can modify and compromise code that executes later. For example, you see the mouse here. An attacker could, for instance, overwrite the bootloader and thus, or bootkit, if you will, implement a bootkit which would either load an alternate kernel or maybe compromise the existing kernel the next time the operating system loads. So, in the old days, about a handful of years ago, like say 5 years ago or so, it was actually trivially easy for an attacker to modify the BIOS, as well as the master boot record. And actually this still pertains today for non-enterprise worthy systems. So what prevents this is firmware signing. One of the things that prevents this is firmware signing. A lot of modern systems, at least enterprise-grade platforms, implement firmware signing, meaning that only a trusted, authorized BIOS/update can actually be burned to the chip. So only a trusted update can be implemented. However, it's important to note that firmware signing only protects the contents of the flash at the time of the actual update process. So in other words, this does not protect any code or data that's not located on the BIOS flash. For example, the bootloader is not going to be located there, as well as also not going to prevent malicious or otherwise updates to the flash outside of the update process. Can we kill that music, please? Yeah. Thanks.
It's
hard to concentrate.
It's not our music.
It's okay. It's the first one of the day. So because it can't protect malicious code from being updated outside that range of the actual update process, malicious writes to the bootloader and such like that aren't going to be prevented, nor if the attacker wants to overwrite the compressed module on the flash that instantiates system management mode, that wouldn't be protected either if they do it at a later time outside of the update process. So a solution to this is provided by the UEFI. So UEFI is a Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. It's the modern BIOS replacement for conventional or legacy BIOS, if you will. It implements standard procedure to bootstrap a system. Implements a lot of publicly defined, publicly available, I should say, standard structures and processes and such to do this. So as of UEFI 2.3.1, it also implements a security feature called SecureBoot. So SecureBoot cryptographically verifies a critical boot component before it is permitted to either load or execute during the boot process. Now, it's important to note that I said during the boot process because similar to the issues with firmware signing, this SecureBoot cannot protect something like the bootloader from being modified outside following the boot process. However, if an attacker were to, like, say, overwrite the bootloader with a bootkit, something like that, whereas the attacker could initially make that change without it being prevented necessarily, on the next reboot, that modified bootloader would, of course, fail the integrity check and not be permitted to boot or execute. Load or execute. So, now SecureBoot actually makes this decision on whether or not to verify these boot components, EFI executables, or whatever you wish to call them, based on the SecureBoot policy. And that secure boot policy is determined by the location of the actual EFI application that's attempting to load and execute. For example, this is from the Secure Boot policy handler from the EFI firmware implementation, the reference implementation that they provided, the EDK2. So, as we can see, if the EFI executable that's trying to install is located on the flash firmware, that's FB, meaning it's in the firmware volume, so it's equivalent of saying that it's located on the BIOS flash firmware, it's permitted to always execute, thus bypassing the Secure Boot signature check, authorization check. And that's fine. That's fine because it's assumed that firmware updates have already verified the contents of the flash prior to this. Now, if that EFI application is located on like an option ROM or the hard drive, fixed media, or removable media like a thumb drive or something like that, then it's going to, well, actually what Secure Boot is going to do is it's going to try to load that policy from what's called UEFI variable. These UEFI variables are stored on the BIOS flash on NVRAM, and they determine whether or not they're going to be signature checked or not. Pretty much by default, they're all going to have their signatures checked. It's actually just in the reference specification. So, speaking of UEFI variables, here we have an example of the setup variable. This is taken from a Dell Latitude E6430. We can see here that it's labeled NV plus RT plus BS. Now NV means that this variable is located on the NV RAM, so it's stored on the BIOS flash. BS means that this variable is accessible, meaning it can be modified by the boot services. And RT means it's accessible from runtime. That being the runtime phase of UEFI, which means that it's modifiable from the operating system. So, Windows 8 actually provides a standard API providing access to access and modify these UEFI variables stored on NVRAM. So, this actually opens the door to a few attacks, mainly because there are no protections associated with this specific setup variable. So, what we have here are 5 bytes highlighted. The first byte, this is the policy. This is actually the Secure Boot on-off enable bit, and the offsets were determined. Actually, I have like 5 or 6 slides that actually talk about how we came across these actual these offsets and such. But I had to chop them for brevity because we only have 45 minutes. But I do have the slides that you heard, the public release version. If anyone has any questions afterwards, we can go over them or whatever. So that is available. But anyway, this indicates whether Secure Boot is on or off. 1 is on. And then these next 4 bytes determine the Secure Boot policy. So this 00 is referring to the policy byte for an image that's located on the firmware volume. So 00 means always execute. So it's always going to execute. And these remaining 3 bytes refer to the policy bytes for images that are located on option ROMs, fixed hard drives, and or removable storage. And they're all set to authorize, basically. So Secure Boot will load these values up when it's trying to determine whether or not it should check the signature, and then it's going to say, okay, well, it's number 4, so I'm going to check the signature of this before I allow it to load and execute. So, technically, however, since I mentioned that this setup variable actually requires no authorization to actually modify it, which means we can use the Windows API to actually, well, we can modify the Secure Boot policy. So that's actually very trivial to do. So technically, we can change those preceding bytes 4 to bypass the signature check, so that whether the EFI executable is located on option ROM or hard drive or otherwise, it's always going to be allowed to permit, thus bypassing the Secure Boot permissions. One thing to note about this is that when we did this, the Secure Boot variable on-off is actually unmodified at all. So technically, if you go like in your PowerShell and run that command to check for Secure Boot on-off, it's still going to say it's on. Attack 2 is deleting the setup variable. Again, it's trivial to modify it, but we can also delete it. So what deleting a variable does, deleting the setup variable specifically, does is it actually takes the system out of secure boot mode. So it puts it into like legacy boot mode or whatever you want to call it. I think it's, I forget what it's called. It's not user mode, it's a different mode. So in this case, so in this case, without actually going in and modifying those variables, still your your bootloader, bootkit, whatever, is still going to be allowed to execute as if secure boot were disabled, because, well, actually secure boot is effectively disabled in this case. In fact, it reflects as disabled too, so it's actually something that's easier to see from the user standpoint. However, attack 3 really piggybacks onto attack 2. So you were able to modify what's called the standard defaults variable. Now, see, when you delete the setup variable, UEFI actually tries to replace its contents with a standard defaults variable also stored on NVRAM. Unfortunately, this variable is also not requiring authentication to modify. So you can go in, same thing we did with attack 1, and actually just overwrite those, well, we can't see them there, but those 3 bytes that pertain to the secure boot policy. And set it also so that all EFI applications will be permitted to execute without being checked for signature verification. So, to summarize this is work that we did actually in conjunction with Intel's PCERT team. We actually co-discovered and co-reported these. This was around the time of Black Hat last year that we started this specifically. So one question is when something like this happens, who's actually responsible for it? Well, this vulnerability was first identified on a Dell Latitude E6430, mainly because that's what we have at MITRE. We have a lot of those laying around, so they were easy to pick up and take a look at. But we found that other vendors, OEMs, were also vulnerable to this. So we know that this problem is not specific to the E6430, however, after reporting it to Dell, we also found later that this problem is not specific to Dell, period. We also found that this vulnerability is not present in the UEFI specification. They actually have their variable set up differently, properly. So, because this vulnerability does not appear, is not limited to a Dell, because it therefore affects multiple OEMs, we believe that therefore this vulnerability was actually introduced, and also because it's not located in the UEFI reference specification, we believe through analysis that this is actually introduced by an independent BIOS developer. So the independent BIOS developers, you've all heard of them, they're like Phoenix, American Megatrends, Award BIOS is another one. Those guys are independent BIOS developers, and they take the UEFI reference specification, kind of modify it, add chipset support for it, and then they sell it to the OEMs like Dell and HP and those guys. But we believe that this vulnerability was actually introduced by someone at AMI based on our analysis. So we've seen how DFI, so now we're going to move towards the actual architectural overrides and permission bypasses too. So we've seen how EFI variables that are writable from the operating system without requiring any authentication or protection to the flash chip, I should say, can be abused and be used to bypass secure boot protections. Now, there are variables that do require authentication. There's a flag that they can be set with in the in their header. They can be set with a flag that's called it's an authentication required. I think I have it in the later slide actually. It's an authentication required bit that's set in any case, which means that it can only be modified by a trusted agent, so to speak. So not just any Windows process or something can go in and modify this variable. So some examples of authenticated variables are the key stores that SecureBoot uses to determine whether or not whether or not to perform the signature check, but whether or not the signature check is valid. So there's key stores located on the NVRAM. There's the key exchange key, but there's also a whitelist of hashes and keys and such that if they match that which was signed, but that was used to sign the application, then it's permitted to execute. And likewise, there's also a key sort of blacklisted, disallowed hashes for UEFI executables. Now, as we're starting to kind of get the idea, there's a lot of stuff stored on the SPI flash. And SPI flash, is technically really the true, technically correct term, but it's the BIOS flash. SPI just stands for Serial Peripheral Interface, it's like a protocol. It's where the BIOS is actually stored. So when I say NVRAM or BIOS flash, I'm speaking equivalents. They're all the same thing. So we have a lot of variables on there. Of course, we have the UEFI executable code, which is also pretty large. So it's starting to get very crowded on the SPI flash chip. Now, we have, as I said, we have the non-volatile, we have variables that are stored on the NVRAM. We also have the UEFI code. And they all require different privileges of read-write, so to speak. Like, you should never be modifying the UEFI code once the system is booted. But of course, the variables itself that we talk about, technically they do have to always be writable. So you can't simply lock it down and say you can't write to these, because technically an application may have legitimate need to add to the whitelist of allowed hashes and such like that. So, Intel provides a number of protection mechanisms that can be used to further lock down the flash. And these are the OEM, like Dell and HP, they really have to go in there and implement these based on their needs and such. But they have to go in and implement these. So they can be summarized into two basic parts. You have global protection, which globally locks down the entire flash. And that's actually provided as a system management mode SMI handler, which is executable code that executes in system management mode. So, and I'll discuss that coming up. And then there's BIOS range write protection, where the OEM has the ability to define certain ranges as being read-only or write protected and such. So first up, this is the global protection. This is if this is the first time you've seen this, it might seem a little bit complex, but if you've seen this before, then it's pretty straightforward. So this is the BIOS control bit. It's located on the LPC. Well, it's located on the chipset. It's located on the controller hub part of the chipset. So it's we have BIOS lock enable, which when set will trigger a system management interrupt whenever an application tries to make the flash writable. So we have BIOS write enable, which this bit here, bit 0, must be set to 1, must be asserted in order for the flash chip to be written to. Now, if BIOS lock enable is also set to 1, that's upon setting this to 1, triggers an SMI, and then the system transitions to system management mode. And thus, an SMI handler executing in system management mode will go back and say, well, this is or is not a valid BIOS update. It's going to reset this back to 0, thus ensuring that the BIOS flash chip is not writable. So, for those of you not familiar with system management mode is a state of the processor, and then when the processor is in system management mode, no other applications are permitted to run. All cores are executing in system management mode at the time, and all other processes that were executing at the time of the SMI being generated are temporarily suspended, and then resumed once we exit from system management mode. So just as a little visual, this is how the BIOS write protection, this is how the global write protection works. So we have ring 0 kernel code. Basically all that's required is a little bit of either port IO permission, so ring 0 execution, or the ability to map memory, because these registers are also going to be mapped to memory via in a PCI Express system. So this application is setting BIOS write enable to 1 because it wants to write to the flash. Now, as we see, the BIOS lock enable bit is also asserted, which means that when we set BIOS write enable to 1, it's going to generate a system management interrupt, and the processor is going to halt all other processes running on the processor on all the cores, and it's going to transition to system management mode. From within system management mode, there's a little routine that's going to run, it's going to check, it's going to say, this is not a valid update, it's going to set BIOS write enable back to 0. The system is going to resume from system management mode, and the application that went to assert BIOS write enable will never know what exactly happened, because it has absolutely no knowledge that system management mode just execute it and reset this bit back to 0. This is just to this slide is just to further make the point that the only way into system management mode is via system management interrupt. That's the only way into system management mode is via an interrupt. So, as I mentioned, there are two BIOS protection mechanisms provided by Intel. The first one being the global protection, which we just discussed. The second one being the BIOS protected range registers. So there's 5 of these provided by vendors. They can use these to define up to 5 page-align ranges to either make them to add write protection or read protection even too, to just various ranges of the SPI flash chip. So this is the BIOS flash that we're talking about. These are memory addresses, not system memory. Just as a side note, this is actually technically, once you set the PR, the protected range registers, vendors should lock them down. Kind of a moot point almost, because hardly any vendors actually utilize the protected range registers, period. But technically, if you were to set your protected range registers, you should set the HFS lock bit, F lockdown, so that further changes to the protected range registers cannot be made. So this just summarizes just what we've talked about, the global write protection, which is provided by system management mode, and then of course the protected range registers, which can be implemented by the vendor to make certain regions of the flash unreadable or unwritable. And just to remind, those variables that we were discussing earlier, those UEFI variables, those cannot be protected using the protected range registers because they always have to be readable and they always have to be writable. So the point of this is that those UEFI variables depend 100% on the global BIOS flash protection provided by system management mode. And this slide actually says exactly what I just said. So, and that works fine as long as the attacker isn't able to somehow suppress system management mode, or I should say suppress system management interrupts, because remember the only way into system management mode is via a system management interrupt. So if the attacker is able to suppress system management interrupts, they effectively disable system management mode because the system, there's no way for the processor to transition to that state. And yes, it can be done. So located in the power management base of the controller hub is the SMI enables register. It's basically it's a register that controls various aspects of timers and such related to system management mode. Well, one of those bits controls whether or not SMIs are going to be suppressed or not. So it's actually fairly easy, again, for any attacker who has ring 0 access is either able to do some port I/O. Actually, in this case, it's going to be only memory mapped I/O, but all they have to do is memory map some physical address space, and that's all they need to do. And they set this bit to 0, thus disabling system management interrupts. Once that's done, that very much effectively disables the BIOS control the global protections, because the system will never actually enter system management mode in order to actually to verify whether or not the flash should or should not be writable. And we've been doing a lot of analysis across several organizations too, like measuring how many systems actually implement the protections and such that we're talking about. And in this case, only, well, I'll talk about SMI lock in a minute, but basically there is a way, of course, there is a way to prevent this, to lock this down so that this can't be tampered with by an attacker or otherwise. That bit that does lock it, only 40% of systems actually implement that lock, so that means 60% of systems have the ability where an attacker can actually go in and suppress SMI. Additionally, there's something called a rollback attack, where you can actually take a BIOS update and roll it back to a vulnerable revision, in which case I number it from 40%, I should say 40% of systems that are vulnerable goes way up past, actually BIOS miss probably goes up way, over 50%, approaching 60. So, Similar, but different, to how the BIOS control global write protection works when the attacker suppresses SMI. As before, the attacker wants to set the BIOS flash chip to write enable so they can modify it because they want to overwrite those variables, say maybe overwrite that secure boot policy so they can write a bootkit and then implement a malicious kernel the next time the system loads. So they want to overwrite that on the flash. So they set that. Now, okay. And, well, nothing happens because even if BIOS lock enable is set, there's no system management interrupt that's going to be generated. So this write enable bit is never reset back to 0. So now the attacker can actually just implement program the SPI configuration registers to actually read and write to the BIOS as they want to. Or use those Windows APIs. So, because the EFI variables rely solely on the global write protection, once SMIs are suppressed, well, the secure boot protections can be trivially bypassed simply by just overwriting the contents of the setup variable. Now I have a demo video to show. Actually, it's really quickly through this, so I'm going to have to pause a lot, kind of explain what's happening. Okay, that's pretty legible. This is going to be an example of a bootkit. So what we have here, and of course, normally an attacker would just, instead of installing a second bootkit, they would just overwrite the original and delete or whatever, but for demo purposes, of course. So we have our good bootloader, this bootloader. And then we have a hacked bootloader that's going to load a malicious, benign malicious kernel. So right now we're just showing an example of trying to execute the shimx64, the hacked version. It was refused because secure boot is enabled. Now what we're doing here is we're going into We're going to go into one of those key stores. This is the white list of key stores of a lot of hashes. So if that evil bootloader is hashed, if the hash of that were added to this key store, then it would have been permitted to boot. So what we're just showing here is just pay attention to these B's and A's. Just note that the GUID, which is in UEFI, is all A's, because eventually we're going to see a new one that's been added. So it's just to show that there's no additional hashes there. Okay, so he's attempting to use flash ROM to modify the SPI flash. Okay, so up here, this is actually this is the value of the BIOS control. So this is actually the BIOS control register. This is where it's located, offset DC of the low pin count PCI device on the controller hub. So it's so he's attempting to set bit 0 here to enable writes. Now it's a little script that goes in and says writes are disabled because remember when we set that normally under good circumstances the system transitions to SMM and that bit is reset back to 0, thus disabling writes. So now we're going to suppress SMI. So we successfully suppressed SMI, and then of course we tried to run the exact same command before to modify the flash, and this time it was successful. Okay. Well, because it was successful, it actually doesn't provide output in typical Unix fashion. So now we've added a new GUID, which follows the GUID of all A's. And this, my colleague who made this video called this Charizard, which I honestly don't know what that is, but it's something. So this isn't the only way to suppress system management interrupts. There are other ways. They are in the data sheets. We're actually working on presentations to show them. But technically, even though it's publicly available in the data sheets, if you guys download them, you can know about them tonight. We can't present anymore just yet for public release rules. But anyway, we have more coming along those lines. But if you grab the data sheets and search SMI and such like that, you'll come across other things that are interesting. So one way to protect this, and this unfortunately is also one of those configuration settings that almost no vendor implements at all. But it's also located in the BIOS control register. This is the same register that contains the BIOS lock enable and the BIOS write enable bits. This is called the SMM write protect disable bit. So it's BIOS write protection. What it says basically is that the flash can only be modified when the processor is in system management mode. And this would actually effectively disable the SMI suppression attack, because even if you were successfully able to suppress SMI, it would do you no good, because unless you also are able, as an attacker, if you are also able to insert yourself into system management mode, you still cannot write to the flash with an arbitrary image. So that effectively disables that attack. And of course, vendors should still also always lock down SMI locked so that the SMI enabled can't be disabled. Excuse me. Yeah, so these are so far across a few organizations, only 6 OEMs have actually implemented this BIOS write protect bit. So that's actually an extraordinarily low percentage. What I don't have handy are the statistics to say how many platforms that we measured actually support this bit. So it's probably going to be technically, applicably, this number should be less than 8,005, because this bit was implemented when Intel implemented their platform controller hub, which is the evolution to their legacy chipset configurations when the memory controller moved up into the processor and stuff. That's when this was actually implemented. So that was around 2009, I think. But still, it's been since 2009, and still only 6 out of 8,500 systems are implementing it. So, well, in conclusion, my conclusion, is that so we've seen that variables, UEFI variables that are unprotected can be easily modified from user space. It's a Win API, by the way, to modify the variables and bypass SecureBoot protections. It's questionable, honestly, and we're not certain yet if that setup variable can even require authentication, because there is stuff in there that's actually unsecured. I lean towards that it should be authenticated, but to be honest with you, more analysis is really needed. Additionally speaking, attackers could suppress SMI to also bypass the Intel SPI flash protections that they provide. So SMI lock should be implemented by vendors to prevent the attacker's ability to disable SMI. Additionally, the Cloud Write Protect bit should also be implemented to at least raise the security posture of the platform, so that an attacker also has to inject themselves into system management mode in order to arbitrarily write to the SPI flash, which would include the UEFI code as well as, of course, those variables. There's related work. This is actually done by the Intel guys at the Intel PCERT team. Gary Mulligan and his colleagues, they presented at Black Hat USA last year. This was actually the first published attack against SecureBoot. These are the guys that we were working with to co-discover and co-report these vulnerabilities which I just presented. And then, of course, there's defeating sign BIOS enforcement, which is myself and my colleagues. We've presented that at many places as well. This actually just goes over a little more of what I've already said, but unfortunately, vendors aren't really doing due diligence right now in terms of locking the system down, so they could do a lot better along those lines. And that's kind of why we're up here presenting this stuff, so hopefully a little public shaming will get them to change their tune and actually lock their stuff down. They're starting to get better. They're receptive. They're receptive. The vendors, the OEMs that we've been speaking with are very receptive. So just some acknowledgements. Rick Martinez, he's our contact at Dell. We've been working with. He's our head of, he's our security architect, security architect there. Rafael used to work at Invisible Things Lab, and I was working on other stuff. But he's been providing a lot of feedback to us. Like we'll send him papers and stuff like that, and he just he comes back with really great suggestions and such. I actually didn't make this slide. We didn't even talk about UEFI components. Thank you. Oh, sure. Any questions?
From the diagrams, many of these systems are representable as state machines. And one would think that formal methods like model checking could be applied to see that the necessary security properties are in place. Are manufacturers doing that? And also, would it get complex when you have boundaries between multiple systems, like your BIOS and early footsteps, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. Unfortunately, the vendors that we've talked to do not apply that sort of thing. Actually, what we did was we created, and I mentioned it, but the way that we've captured the statistics that we do have is we actually wrote a kernel driver that runs out of Windows that actually goes out and just verifies these measurements. I mean, a lot of them are just in the chipset configuration registers and PCI devices, so it's really trivial. Just write something that actually goes out and checks them. In addition, of course, the API does provide access to the variables, so you can go in and look and see what the policies are and such, as well as the attributes applied to these variables. So we've actually so we're actually licensing that not for money, but it's a code for data kind of agreement. So we license out the source code to organizations where they can run that, and then they provide us the anonymized data so we can add it to our research, because what we want to do is we want to bump that number 8,000 up to about 100,000 and then publish a paper with good, because a large number is a better sample size. So we want to be able to publish that and just say that, you know, this is how prevalent vulnerable virus is in the wild. This is the plan. So, any other questions?
So I understand that some of these are variable from user space. Are all variables variable from user space, or do you need to have some administrative access to those things?
Yeah, the authenticated. Yeah, there are authenticated variables like those. The key stores like that DB whitelist and such. We want to do that requires authentication. So technically, you might be able to access it, but you won't get through to it unless you have a trusted agent actually trying to do the modification. Which is why that when we modified that at the end, we had to use SMI suppression. So we could just do direct overwrite of the flash instead of going through and modifying the variable.
So an attack would be either getting some sort of privilege escalation on Windows or whatever is running on it, or have like physical access and boot a Linux and just flash it from there.
Yeah, it can. I think remotely is more the model that we're going for. As long as you can execute Ring0 instructions, then you can at least get far enough. You can try to modify the settings required to perform these attacks. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
What level of activity have you seen in exploitation of this problem?
Officially, it's mostly anecdotal evidence, really. I mean, we haven't really seen any firmware rootkits. I mean, we've identified that it can be trivially easy to do this, but we haven't actually encountered any instances where this is happening. You know, if you follow certain websites and such, and there are, what is it, the ant list or whatever it is, describes things of this, not of this nature specifically, but they do describe various rootkits, but I'll allege it or however you want to describe it. But yeah, no, I mean, there was, for like hard evidence, and by hard evidence, I mean it's on Wikipedia, you know, there's the Chernobyl, the CIH virus, which was like in China in like the late 90s, which just trivially overwrote BIOS with all hexadecimal Fs or something like that, just to create DOS attacks on 20 million laptop user computers, according to Wikipedia, but it's really mostly anecdotal evidence.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Round of applause. If people could take a moment and help us with feedback, on the form.